Mish!
Heya! Today I've got an absurdly long painting video for you guys, and the subject is Station Forge's grimdark Frostwatch. Station Forge makes some top quality STLs, and I encourage you to check out their selection. I also wanted to give a shout out to Mad Max Minis. These guys run a licensed printing shop on Etsy and distribute 8K printed models. To be clear, I am not sponsored by either of these guys, I just want to push my crawdads in the right direction for some good quality miniatures. Speaking of which, let's get to the painting. But before we do that, I've got a little list for all the paints used in this video. Take a look. Or don't. You can skip ahead. I'm not your mom. I am your real dad, however. So to start things off, I've Zenithal primed the fella, and I'm going to be starting with a base coat of Pallid Witch Flesh. This is a very thin coat because I ultimately decided I wanted to try more of the Pro Acryl series, so I ended up painting over this using Dark Ivory. Despite this not being essential to the process, I felt it necessary to add this in. For the rest of his squad, I ended up doing the exact same thing, except I used an airbrush for the initial base coat. I wanted to speed things along. This color is surprisingly strong for how bright it is, and it doesn't leave any crumbs. You'll see throughout this video that this color is something that I've become somewhat obsessed with. I've had similar affinities with Ghost Gray and Metallic Silver, so this is nothing new. I probably should have gone for a sub-assembly when making this miniature, but I got too excited to build these guys. As you can see, I'm being very diligent to pick out the hard-to-reach areas early on. To paint the fur along the trench coat, I started with Dryad Bark. I was sure to keep this quite thin, as I didn't want to obscure any details on the fur. There are a ton of little areas around the trench coat with this fur, and it's very easy to miss them, mostly underneath the gas mask. It's not the end of the world if you don't get this on right away. We're going to be touching this up plenty throughout the video, so don't worry. Just try to be careful not to get it on any of the dark ivory. It'll be kind of a pain in the butt to clean that up. At this point, I added another thin coat of dark ivory to the trench coat, making sure to give a bold color to the fatigues. As you can see, this second coat really cements this color well. When I initially got this set, I had the idea to paint these guys in a much more cool-hued tone. I'm happy that I ultimately chose to go for a warmer hue. I think it looks really good. Originally, the idea for this video was going to be a huge video on different types of fatigues, but the miniatures I ordered for it just didn't come in yet, so that's something that I'll put off for later. Expect that soon, though. For all the ammo pouches, straps, and the backpack, I base coated using Vallejo Model Color Dark Gray. I was sure to be very diligent as not to spill on the ivory. Another example of why I should have done a sub-assembly. Whatever, these guys look too cool. Planning out my projects is something that I'll never be able to do, and I'm proud of it. Thinking is for nerds. For his gloves, Ushanka, and tactical blankie, I use Skarsnik Green. I think this color works really well with the dark ivory. It's a little on the thin side, but our Zenithal Prime will really help us out. I would then use Black Legion contrast over the gas mask, tubes, and the pauldrons. Contrast paints like this make this project really weird, as I really do a lot of convoluted and overall excessive paint jobs, but sometimes I just use things like this to speed the process along. For his pants, I ended up using Militarum Green Contrast. I'll go into further detail later on about the underlying fatigues. There's really not a lot of areas on this guy that I can paint this camo, and the only parts that are really sticking out are the bottoms, and I didn't really want to paint underneath the trench coat. But for now, I'm just using his buddy here to give you a better look at the color. Like I stated previously, I wanted this video to be about a lot of different fatigues, but since the miniatures I had planned for that didn't come in, I figured I'd just add in little parts using his buddies. I want these guys to be a coherent kill team, so I didn't change up the colors all that much. I then went back in with Black Legion and applied it to the boots. Here is where things get a little weird. I decided to sort of glaze/shade the trench coat in a mixture of Dryad Bark and Lamian Medium. Not really sure why I did this, but this little experiment really carried the entirety of this video. Sure, I could have done a normal shade and I'm sure it would have looked good, but being adventurous is what miniature painting is all about. But before I did so, I fussed with the pauldrons a bit, adding in some sponging of Oxford Blue and Burnt Red for underlying colors. It looks weird now, but I think it looks quite interesting once I dry brushed over using Wolf Grey. Once again, I'm applying a layer of my weird glaze. I had to set the mini down in a weird position for it to dry properly, but it was already too late and I got this really weird coffee stained effect. And I really liked it. I think it looks really realistic, and it sort of looks more realistic than any other weathering powder I've done for splotches. I'd take advantage of this, focusing this glaze further into the shadows of the mini. It was basically a very strong recess shade. It definitely looks a little grody right now, but trust the process. Once that dried, I'd add in very thin dark ivory over the trench coat and the raised edges. This took a good long while, and that's part of the process, is just trusting it. It looks a little ugly at this point, but I think I got it to a place that it looks really good. I really wanted this guy to look almost comic book style in terms of the coloring. I love me my sketchy approach, and if you're new to my content, I have a habit of saying this in almost every episode. And the same goes to me calling some sort of method I'm using convoluted. That's just how I paint. Though the effect takes time, I encourage you to stick with it. With each pass around that we go over with this color, it starts to look better and better in my opinion. It's obviously sped up, but I really wanted to capture just about every single moment that I had painting this. It's definitely a little difficult for me to verbally tell you just exactly what I'm doing here. This is something that you just have to watch and feel for yourself, to be honest. I'd end up using some very watered down ivory to kind of blend the shadows in with the main color, keeping the strong contrast but also keeping it a little bit more sightly for the eyes. Dotting in the colors is kind of essential to the process. You just kind of have to be patient with it and feel it out. Here I'm just neatening up with a little Dryad Bark on the fur. This is something I'd end up doing a few times throughout the video. As you can also see, I'm adding in just a little bit more of my little glaze right in the recesses, really trying to focus it as a shade. The thicker the paint is to the medium, the more likely you'll get that splotchy effect, so watering it down more and more with the medium is a good way to get an actual shade. Moving on from the ivory, I'm using a little bit of Agrax Earthshade all over the fur. I'm also adding the Agrax Earthshade right around where the fur and the trench coat meet. It's kind of a recess shade for the trench coat, but not exactly. We're only focusing this around the areas with the fur. For the gloves, Ushanka, and blanket, I'm using some Athonian Camo shade. It was at this point I also kind of realized I made him look like Kyle. I didn't really mean for this to happen. I almost painted the Ushanka the same color as the backpack, but I'm kind of glad I went with the green. Back to the trench coat, I then add in a little bit more dark ivory to the sharpest points. What's ironic is I kind of made the base coat the highlight color. After all that glazing, of course. To highlight the fur, I used a little bit of Doombull Brown, but I wasn't exactly happy with it, so I mixed a little bit of the dark ivory into the Doombull Brown. I would very gently dot this onto the curls in the fur, keeping the closest edges highlighted as not to spill any paint into any shaded areas. Over the green areas, I then re-established the Skarsnik green, kind of sketching out the highlights. As you can see, I'm being very messy, but also very purposeful with my highlights. Especially on top of the Ushanka and the knuckles on the mittens. You can see just how much this figure pops out with these highlights. I'd then sketch on some scratches over the pauldrons using wolf gray, and I'd add a few drops of Nuln Oil over the pauldrons just to give it kind of a random splotch. I'd then use Black Legion over the entirety of the gun. I probably could have done this earlier, but whatever. Over all the gray areas, I used Nuln Oil, and I made sure to really coat this entire area to make sure I got some good contrast. For the butt of the gun, I said butt, I used some Rhinox hide, and then I would use some Iron Warriors over the Aquila on his hat. To highlight the gun, I'm using some Doombull brown, and I'm adding a touch of dark ivory to the brown to make some scratches. I'm sorry for using this color so much, I like it. Using a dry brush, I'd then go over the entirety of the gun using metallic silver. I'd be sure to be careful as not to get it on any of his mittens or any of the coat. I'll then use a detail brush to more carefully apply this over the gun, gas mask, sling buckles, and the rivets on his pauldrons. Just some random thoughts that have been kind of occurring to me while I edit this video, but there's a lot of you guys in my comments section that comment pretty consistently. I'm wondering, how long have you guys been painting? I'd love to know. That and like, are there any weird goblin-esque habits that you have when it comes to painting? I mean, I've showcased more than a few on this channel, so I'm curious to hear what the crawdads have. For the Tyrannid skull on his backpack, I used Pallid Bone Speed Paint. Also like to mention that I really love this paint. It's easily one of my favorite single coat paints on the market. Speaking of Army Painter, I've been really curious about that Warpaint Fanatics or whatever. Though, between the Pro Acryl base set and Army Painter stuff, I don't know, man. I'm gonna be eating paint more frequently than usual. For the Genestealer chitin on the crest, I used a little bit of McCrag blue, and I'd apply some Nuln Oil later on and highlight with Calgar blue off camera. To highlight the backpack and sling, I'm using some dark gray mixed with some wolf gray in a 2:1 ratio. And once I had finished my first highlight, I added a little bit more wolf gray for a strong, stark finish. Come to think of it, it's not often that I really see a lot of painting tutorials for 3D printed miniatures, so if there's anything that you guys find that you really want to see painted, send a link my way. I technically have a 3D printer, but I don't use it all too often as I really don't have a place that's safe for me to use it in. But hopefully that'll change soon, and downloading STLs takes about 2 seconds, so if you got something cool, I'd love to see. For this little thingy of ropes on his backpack, I used some Xandri dust, and just a couple coats will do. I always like to differentiate any colors that might be similar to one another. Like for example, using Dryad Bark and Rhinox Hide for 2 different brown things. I don't know, just adds more visual interest. I then decided to use some Oblivion Black Wash from 2 thin coats over all the metallics. I really like how this finishes. Especially compared to the modern iteration of Nuln Oil, it just has a very different look and it's so strong. Personally, I prefer a very strong paint that I have to water down over a paint that's not strong at all and I have to apply several times for it to look good. That isn't to say that Nuln Oil didn't do a good job in this painting tutorial. I just miss the old recipe. At this point, I'd like to mention some off-camera colors, primarily over the eyes. I used some very watered-down mahogany in the eye sockets, and then I'd paint the rim around the eyes using silver metallic. Also, all the green areas were quickly given an extra highlight of Skarsnik mixed 2-to-1 with elfic flesh. Moving on to the backpack, I used a very weird method for painting these bandages. I guess it didn't resonate with me that these are in fact bandages because I painted them burnt red for some reason. I guess technically using this color, I ended up making them look like used bandages and he's just recycling. Anyway, I then highlight the Aquila using metallic silver, and I'd highlight the gas mask and the tubes using dark gray. After doing so, I then painted on some very watered down burnt red into the eye sockets. For these weird test tube things, I decided to go for a yellowish sort of color. I mixed a little bit of Averland Sunset with a touch of black, and I'll explain my reasoning a little later. For the ropes, bandages, underside of the fur, and the Aquila, I'd use a little bit of Agrax Earthshade. To highlight the tubes, I used a little bit of Dark Sun Yellow, and I'd kind of feather it in, as you can see here. The reason why I painted these things yellow is I kind of wanted them to resemble the concentration stems from Darktide. I don't know why this kit has test tubes, though if I had to guess, they're meant to be some sort of IV sort of tubes or whatever. This was originally a spare medic backpack that I converted using the Gene Stealer skull, so that might be what it is. For the ropes on the backpack, I dry brushed on some elfic flesh. And for the bandage thingies, I ended up using some burnt red with a little bit of wolf gray. As you can probably tell, I didn't realize until after I painted the miniature that it was really weird to paint these red. For the corks and the test tubes, I used a little bit of Ushabti bone. And yes, that took about 8 tries for me to not say Ushtabi bone. For whatever reason, it's ingrained in my brain to say it like that. As a final little highlight for the tubes, I used some Dark Sun Yellow with some elfic flesh. After doing so, I was happy with the miniature, so I decided to base him. Obviously, because of his attire, I decided to go for a bitter cold Arctic tundra. I'd start with Pro-Acryl Coarse Texture Paint as an underlying environment for the bases. I found that my little silicone sculpting tools are actually really good for terrain paints. Maybe I'm living under a rock, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone else use these things in this way. Once the texture had fully dried, I used a good amount of Oblivion Blackwash over the entire base, and after that dried, I dry brushed over using a little bit of Wolf Gray. I'd then pick out parts using Dark Sea Blue, mostly around the edges of the base. Over these areas, I'd then use a good old bitch brush and use some UV resin. Once it fully cured, I'd go over with a sanding stick, creating a glare texture. I try to be pretty sparing with this as I don't want to lose any of the glossiness that comes with the UV resin. I'm debating on whether or not I should have added more snow to this base, but I think the overall rocky texture along with the ice makes it look really cool. There's some other colors that you could use instead of dark sea blue. I think a lot of them are more so on the lighter side of blue, especially if you're going for a more bright, snowblind-esque winter, but I wanted this to be more gruff. To finish the base, I just added some random splotches of Valhallan Blizzard, and a cute little tuft. I think it's also a really cool idea to take a little bit of Valhallan Blizzard and sprinkle it in your hands to create some actual snowflakes. And as one final thingy for this guy, I decided to add just a little bit of resin to the eyes. I then paint over the bands of the gun using some Black Legion 2, as I kinda noticed it was the same color and it bugged me. But other than that, he's done. That's really all there is for the main mini, and I think he turned out really well. For how many bizarre steps I took along the way to get to this point, I think it was worth it. I really don't have too many regrets of this miniature. Besides the Aquila, I kinda like the dull down metallic better than the shiny look. But hey, I appreciate if you stuck around this long to see him painted. Everything beyond this point is just some extra stuff I did for his buddies. Take a look. So to start things out for the bonus section, I painted this big power glove. I'd base coat with Beastly Brown, and over this I would glaze on some Rhinox hide. I'll warn you now, a lot of this is glazing. I then dry brush over the fist using Parasite Brown, giving it a little bit of an orangish brown foundation. I then sponge on some Rise of Rust, then dry brush over and glaze on some Wild Rider Red. After this, I glazed on heavily using watered down Jokera Orange, focusing it mostly on the broader sections. After doing so, I would dry brush over using Iron Warriors. I'd then make some splotching glazes using Rise of Rust. After this, I began mixing Orange Flare into the watered down Ryza. This is a very convoluted glaze recipe, and I totally didn't pull it out of my butt while painting. As you can see, we're continually building up to purer and purer Orange Flare as we continue glazing. Like the trench coat, this is a big trust the process sort of thing, but I don't know, man. I think this one is a lot more convoluted than the trench coat. Despite already having a really good recipe for painting orange, I don't know why I do this to myself where I overcomplicate things. But as you can see, the more I keep going, the better it looks. I think the internal time commitment clock in my head is always thrown off every time I paint another miniature. It seems nowadays I've kind of lost my ability to paint something simple. Well, at least as a full model. Sometimes I'll spend about 2 seconds on a miniature, and the other half of the miniature I'll spend about 5.5 hours. think the biggest thing about miniature painting that's been talked about recently is the FOMO effect, or the goblin brain. This is something that definitely resonates with me, mostly because every time I paint miniatures nowadays, I think about how I could make this miniature look amazing, and if I just painted it to play with it, it just wouldn't feel the same. I feel like getting over this would be really helpful to my pile of shame. Maybe painting some pile of shame kill teams would be a fun idea. Something that forces me to play the game, too. And we'll finish off with some sharp highlights and scratches using Troll Slayer Orange as a finishing touch. I find that most orange colors tend to dry very, very thinly. I felt that using Troll Slayer Orange was a more appropriate final color as it really stuck out from the rest of the orange. For the little skull badge on the back of the gauntlet, I used a little bit of black and some metallic silver. I then add in some Oblivion Blackwash over the metal of the fist and the skull badge. I'd finish this off using some metallic silver. To finish off the orange section, I'd use a little bit of black and dryad bark to fill in the scratches, giving us a great worn and torn effect. Again, this is basically just my Angel's Resplendent recipe, but with a lot more blending, and I guess Rise of Rust is different, so whatever. Despite how messy this recipe was, I'm really happy with how this turned out. And at the very least, I hope it was enjoyable to watch. Power gloves have always been kind of a favorite of mine, and I don't know, it makes me feel very old school 40k. Except this isn't 40k at all because these are not 40k miniatures. These are Frostguard, not anything to do with another IP. Battle Axe 4000. This is a stupid f***ing bit. Okay, now onto the fatigues. Earlier I showed you the Militarum green contrast, but here's a little refresher. I'm going for some old school camo, and this is a very easy method to make your Astra Militarum figures look way more interesting. Being that kriegsmen are already a mixture of European colors and different attires, I thought it would be cool to take some Russian colors mixed with German colors to make these guys all the more interesting. Again, this is something that I wanted to touch on in this video, but the miniatures didn't show up, I've already explained it. But we'll have something to look forward to later on. Once our color is dry, I'm adding in some warm brown from Pro-Acryl just to make these splotch brown patterns. Honestly, I think it looks really good on its own, but I decided to take it a little further with some dots of Skarsnik green, mixed with a little bit of Ustabi bone. Wow, I really can't say that word. This method is simple, effective, quick to pull off, and it looks great. Also, if you're curious, the little crew cap is painted in the same way that I painted the backpacks. I was originally going to include it, but I don't feel like it's necessary. Next, I'm going to show you how to paint the helmets. I would start by very wetly dry brushing, more or less stabbing the helmets using dark gray. This gave a very effective chipped effect. I'd then splotch on some different colors like Jokera orange, or just some browns to add some random paint scratches. I'd clean up any areas around the recesses using dark gray, as chipping around the corners would be much less prevalent. I'd also add this color to the edges of the helmet, and I do all these methods on the pauldrons. I'd speckle some Nuln Oil over the pauldrons as well, and I'd shade in the recesses of the helmet. I'd then go over with a dry brush using some metallic silver. Over the Aquila, I'd use Iron Warriors. I'd then shade the Aquila using Oblivion Blackwash, and I'd use a little bit more metallic silver on the mask, rivets, and his sword. Side note, the swords in this kit are incredibly flimsy. That's just kind of a downside of resin miniatures. I'd then shade in the sword using Blackwash as well, and once it dried it would be accompanied by Tyron Blue. For the guy's base, I wanted a little blood. I ended up using my main mixture of blood and I watered it down, spraying over with my airbrush. I then add in a little bit of mahogany, and I found this color to be very effective for making older dried blood on the fatigues. I have a recipe for this blood mixture, and you can check it out in my second video. If there are any undesirable splotches of blood on the fatigues, you can very easily wipe them away with a wet brush. That, and you can move around some of the paint to make it look a little bit more realistic and blend into the fabric. I then give the sword one last highlight of metallic silver right on the blade, and then I would add some splatters to the blade itself. Less is more with blood, and I'm quite happy with how this guy turned out. Like I mentioned earlier, resin is very fragile. I ended up having to re-glue the blade to the sword, and when I mean re-glue, I mean I completely lost the first blade. I have no idea where it went. I looked one way and then it was missing. So thankfully Mad Max Mini sent me a duplicate, so I had another blade to go with it. I had a lot of fun painting this guy. It was satisfying painting the helmet. I feel like it's really realistic. And as a final little bonus thingy, I decided to paint the medic's helm using inspiration from a Japanese construction helm. I'd be very careful to freehand the line with mahogany. This took me a while, but I think it turned out pretty decent when all said and done. As you can see, I kind of readjusted my positioning. The biggest thing with freehanding is finding the right angle. You can see me kind of adjusting myself several times throughout this process. I don't know why I decided to torture myself with this, but I think it looks cool. That is until I had to do the other side. Yeah, not too good. I fixed it to a degree, but hey, it was a good excuse to make the helm look a little bit more beat up. For his pauldrons, I ended up doing the exact same colors as the cross, using some mahogany and then burnt red. I used the exact same effects as I used earlier on the chipping on the pauldrons and helmet. Once I finished up all my chipping and weathering effects on the helmet and pauldrons, I'd end up touching up the red colors. I'd also finish off the red using a mix of burnt red and ghost gray as a final highlight. Once the red was finished, I decided to call these 4 guys completed. I'm really happy with these little dudes. Admittedly, a lot of these paint jobs are a lot more complicated in work than they needed to be, but that's pretty much every miniature I paint. But all in all, I hope this video was enjoyable and most of all helpful. And if you liked what you saw, I'd greatly appreciate it if you left a like, comment, and subscribe for more. Next week, I've got something really special planned for you guys, and I'm super excited to show you. One last thing I'd like to mention is I really appreciate the turnout I got in the last video. I never expected that, and it's really cool to see. But I think I've done enough talking, and I think it's time we wrap up this video. I'll leave you with a mishmash, kit bash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.